What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Hidden Forces with me, Demetri Kofinas. Today, we speak with Sam Bowles. Dr. Bowles is a research professor at the Santa Fe Institute, where he heads the Behavioral Sciences program. His studies on cultural and genetic evolution have challenged the conventional economic assumptions that people are motivated entirely by self-interest. He is the author of nearly 20 books, such as The Moral Economy and A Cooperative Species. He served as an economic advisor to the governments of Cuba, South Africa, and Greece, as well as to the U.S. presidential candidates Robert F. Kennedy and Jesse Jackson. In this episode, we follow the archaeological record in pursuit of the footprints of Homo economicus, the only known, rationally expectant, utility-maximizing hominid ever to walk the earth. We take the road from Aristotle, paying heed to his ethics and to his convictions that laws should not be made to restrain evil, but to cultivate good, that this was the test of a good constitution. But with the collapse of Rome and Europe's descent into darkness emerged ideas of life as brutish and man as wicked. Hobbes's Leviathan and Machiavelli's Prince were driven not by the aspirations of man's highest ideals, but by appealing to the lowest, most unimpressive motives of his animal nature. Later, political economists like Bernard Mandeville and Adam Smith took this further, seeking to harness the industries of avarice, converting self-interest towards the public good. The invisible hand emerged, and with it, notions of separability. Homo sapien existed in one realm, and Homo economicus in another. The beneficent, moral being on the one hand, and the selfish, utility-maximizing agent on the other. Laws were built upon this framework, ideas of the marketplace, incentives and regulations, what economists call mechanism design. What have we learned in the years since that have challenged the foundations of these assumptions? What are some of the insights of behavioral economists, moral philosophers, and evolutionary psychologists that task the fitness of Homo economicus in the 21st century? And what types of habitats can we design that are better suited to the citizens of Aristotle's legislator than to the aberrations of modern economic man? As always, you can gain access to reading lists put together by me ahead of every episode by visiting the show's website at hiddenforcespod.com. Lastly, if you are listening to this show on iTunes or Android, make sure to subscribe. If you like the show, write us a review. And if you want a sneak peek into how the sausage is made, or for special storylines told through pictures and questions, then like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod. And now, let's get right to this week's conversation. Sam Bowles, Professor Sam Bowles, it's great to be sitting here with you at the Santa Fe Institute Library ahead of this conversation on moral psychology, moral economics. Your book is actually called The Moral Economy. I've watched some of your lectures, as you know, we spoke about that. I've read your book. And the thing that fascinates me most about your work, and we're going to cover a number of things, but just on the outset to our audience to say, what I find most interesting is the way in which you combine your insights and the work of Hayek and the information problem and prices with behavioral psychology, behavioral economics. So, I'm curious if there's anyone else that does that. I was not familiar with that. But why don't you sort of start us? I think it would be great if we started along the path of, beginning with Aristotle, the road from Aristotle that takes us down the path of how the economic profession embraced or came to view human beings as Homo economicus, divorced of sort of mortal sentiments and being a self-actualizing agent for utility maximizer.
If you start with Aristotle, he was keenly aware of the fact that how we govern our societies has a big effect on what kind of citizens we turn out to be. In fact, he said the chief task of the legislator is to design laws that will inculcate good habits in citizens. And he went on to say, it is this that is the test of a good constitution. Not one test of a good constitution, but the test of a good constitution. That is to produce a citizenry that has civic values of commitment to each other, generosity, and so on. Now, that's a view that persisted over a great many years, up until the Middle Ages. And basically the idea was that good citizens were the requirement of a good society. And there's a lot of religious and other moral thinking about that. The first break in that tradition comes with Machiavelli. Machiavelli is a guy who is despised because he is said to have thought that morals didn't matter. That's not at all the true account of Machiavelli. He understood that morals mattered a great deal. But he also understood that in governing, we had to think of, well, what do you do about the guys who really don't share the morality of the rest of the population? How do you deal with them? And in his book, The Discourses, which is actually a much more profound book than his more famous book, The Prince, he said, "It is said that all men are wicked. Hunger makes them industrious, and laws make them good." Now, I want to remind you what he said. He said, "It is said." He didn't say this is true. He said this is an adage which was current in the Italian of the time. And he then went on to say that we should take account of the fact that at least some people have these, what he would call, vices. He didn't say that we should ignore their morality, but he did say that in designing a constitution, we should think of normal people and what he called the natural and ordinary human humors, by which he meant just values and preferences that people have. Then if you move on to the early 18th century, this idea was picked up, I don't know if directly or not, by a rather quirky Dutch doctor living in London. His name was Bernard Mandeville. And he wrote a scandalous book called The Fable of the Bees. And this was a fable which was about bees, because had he said these things about humans, he probably would have been run out of town. And what he said was this. Mandeville had this fable of the bees, and the bees were really a nasty group of people. They were selfish, lascivious, as he said, given to leisure and to over-conspicuous consumption.
Basically nothing like bees.
Nothing like ordinary bees. It's a very funny story because, of course, he knew nothing about what we now know about bees as a highly cooperative insect. In any case, these were individualistic bees, also given to the vices of the time, including avarice and greed. And the hive went on very well. So he said in this fable, the worst of all the multitude of the bees, the worst of all the multitude did something for the common good. And they went on to say, such were the blessings of that state, their crimes conspired to make them great. And so this was a kind of a strange situation in which the viceful society was doing well. And then, just to make the point very clearly, at a certain point, the bees got religion, and they all got to be really nice bees and following the morality of the day. And the hive collapsed, and there was a disaster for the bees because then nobody was consuming, and nobody could sell their products or whatever. I forget the story. Anyway, it was scandalous because what he was suggesting is that good outcomes could result from ordinary motives. And that was the same idea that Machiavelli had. That is, in governing well, the human capacity is not that we're saints. Our capacity, which distinguishes us from most other animals, is not our goodness, but it's our capacity to design laws that can harness ordinary people to do good for the society as a whole. And that's what Mandeville, Bernard Mandeville, early 18th century in London, that's what he was trying to do. Well, it was just a short step between that and Adam Smith later in the same century, in which Adam Smith then got the idea, self-interest can actually have very good effects in society. And so Smith famously said, it is not the self-interest of the brewer, the baker, and the butcher who puts your dinner on the table. It's their regard for their own interest. And then he amplified and he went on and he said, and it's even better that it's their self-interest that's doing this. Sometimes society works better when people are simply trying to watch out for themselves instead of trying to do good for the public. Well, now that's a radical shift because now essentially Smith is saying, and along with Machiavelli, we can do pretty well with ordinary citizens. We don't ask them to have special morality. Now, Smith, of course, was very concerned about human morality and wrote a very good book about it, in which he said, of course, that humans are acutely moral and our societies work well because of it. But there are some realms in which it works tolerably well, even if people are self-interested.
And of course, there's also inherent in that, and Mandeville touches on it, and then of course Adam Smith gets to it explicitly, which is this notion that the good emerges from the cumulative sum of the amoral parts of the system. It's sort of emergent, which is what the invisible hand would be. Is that correct?
Right. In the passage in which Smith talks about the invisible hand, the famous idea that society would be guided as if by an invisible hand, one imagines he may have been thinking, or thinking that his readers would think, the invisible hand of God. An invisible hand will guide the society towards a good outcome, even though no individual in that society cares about it. So that's the basic idea of the invisible hand. Now, Smith never thought that that should be applied throughout society, but he did identify some conditions under which it might work reasonably well. Now, the only reason why this was tolerable in 1776, when Adam Smith published his great book, The Wealth of Nations, the only reason why this was tolerated by his readers was that over the previous 2 centuries, the idea of greed, or avarice as it was called, had been converted from what had before been considered to be one of the 7 deadly sins. It had gradually been converted to a normal human motive, among others, and not particularly culpable.
Was that an outgrowth of Calvin and Calvinism?
I think it was not. I think the primary driving force in this whole process was the previous century, which in Europe was a century of war, much more so than the 20th century. The number of deaths in Europe in the 17th century as a fraction of the population exceeded by far the number of deaths during what we now call the century of total war, namely the 20th century, the First and Second World War. It was a period of religious wars, of zealotry, of intolerance, and of course of all the hardship that was caused. And so when Dr. Samuel Johnson said, just the year before Smith published his book, he said, "I can hardly think of any way more harmless for a person to go about his business than to be making money. That is, making money is something which is a harmless activity, and we should encourage making money." And what was he thinking? He was thinking that the alternative to self-interest was zealotry. That's what his concern was. And so throughout the 17th century and the 18th century, the thinkers were not concerned that people might be too selfish, too concerned about themselves. They were worried about the other kinds of concerns, as I say, religious zealotry, intolerance, and so on. And so for them, self-interest was kind of an antidote to that. And that's what I don't think Smith thought, that self-interest was actually an admirable motive. But I think it became tolerable. It became accepted in polite company that self-interest would be an okay motive. So I think the kind of domestication of avarice took place long before economics had a powerful hold on people's minds. And it took place in the environment, which I said, in which the fear was not greed and the kind of rapacious avarice that you now see in the world today, but rather it was that there are a number of motives that need to be tamed, and self-interest would be one of them.
You know, that's interesting when you talk about that transition and the fear of war and revolution, perhaps, and other forms of insurrection against the established order. It reminds me in many ways of something actually we recently covered on the show. I did an episode very recently on the Chinese banking system, and we sort of traced the evolution of Chinese society and the Chinese economy after the revolts at the Tiananmen Square and the crackdown by the Chinese government and the subsequent way in which the Chinese government proceeded to sort of attempt to appease the citizenry or the population or the workers by promising them material gains in return for obedience. And I think there's something similar there in what you're saying. And it also reminds me, of course, of Hobbes and Rousseau. Where do they fall in this transition? Because the work that they did in this regard was very significant.
Well, both Hobbes and Rousseau, in different ways, posed the problem of how do we live in a society of relatively free people, no longer bound by tradition or by obligation to a patriarchal family or to other forms of tradition. How do we organize such a society in a way that can achieve a rather remarkable result, which is that people should be free to carry out their activities according to their own values, but the result should be an outcome which people would prefer. That is, they would like that outcome. So they have to take actions that they prefer, but the outcome has to also be an action which, when we look at it retrospectively, is one which we find acceptable. Now, we know that that's not the way the world works. There are many, many situations, the prisoner's dilemma being the most famous of them, in which taking care of your own interests, acting in a self-interested way, will lead you to a result that neither you nor the other player would prefer.
Could you please explain what the prisoner's dilemma is for our audience?
The Prisoner's Dilemma is a game. The story behind it, and the reason which gives it its name, is that two individuals are walking in a neighborhood, and they happen to be carrying breaking and entering tools, and they're apprehended by the police, who have no evidence that they've committed a crime. They separate the two prisoners, and they interrogate them. And they're told, each individually, that if you confess and essentially implicate the other person, you'll get a light sentence. If you confess and the other person also confesses, then you'll get a heavy sentence. If you both hold out, you may go free. Well, it turns out that in this situation, the best thing to do is to confess, no matter what you do. So both prisoners will confess and they both go to prison. Whereas if both had held out, they would actually walked. Now, that's a classic game in which when people cooperate, they can do better than when they act self-interestedly. That game, and the idea of the game, has been applied to environmental problems and to many problems in society. For example, obeying norms in traffic and being generous towards others. These are situations in which if everybody does it, it's definitely a good thing to do, but you would do better yourself if you just defected.
In other words, the rational action, if we were to assume that each actor is selfish, is to just simply look out for oneself, because no matter what, whether the other person reciprocates or not, you will be better off. But what you're saying is that if both parties participate together, collectively, they'll be better off, of course.
Right, and this poses the problem of cooperation, obviously. In those situations in which cooperation is mutually beneficial, will yield a result in which we both prefer to the result that we would get if we each pursued our self-interest. How do we make sure that people will cooperate then, instead of competing in a self-interested way? Well, the genius of Adam Smith was that he figured out also, let's ask the other problem. There are many situations in which it's better if people compete. And he posed the market as a good case of that. When he talked about businessmen in a particular field, he said whenever they get together, the conversation turns to how we can collaborate in some way to raise the prices, that is to form a cartel and to defraud the public. So Smith's ideas in The Wealth of Nations were a great example of how making it difficult to cooperate by eliminating monopolies and cartels in markets would be socially beneficial. But we also know, Aristotle knew, Machiavelli knew, all the philosophers knew, that sometimes we have to cooperate to achieve the ends which each of us would like to see, but neither of us will contribute to personally unless we're somehow bound by some cooperative norm or agreement. And those are the problems we're facing today with climate change and many others, the spread of epidemics, for example, addressing the problem of political violence. These are all problems which require very large-scale cooperation. And therefore, we have to be concerned, like Aristotle was, with the kinds of norms and the kinds of values that people have. So we have to go back to Aristotle and then think about, well, how are we doing on that score? Now, let me add one additional piece of information, because it could well be that Adam Smith is our guide here. Adam Smith wrote one book about morality, which he thought was very important, and he wrote another book, The Wealth of Nations, about incentives and about markets and so on. Two brilliant books. Most people have not seen the books as very connected, and I think neither did Adam Smith. And the reason is a simple one. He was thinking that when we respond to economic incentives, to prices and profits and so on, we're behaving in some way which you might call self-interested. But of course, that doesn't diminish our morality. In other situations, we'll be responding to our norms. So there are maybe spheres in life, and as a citizen, we'll be civic-minded and generous and law-abiding, and as family members, we'll be loving and kind and responsible. And as shoppers, we can be as selfish as we want. So the basic Smithian idea, and the idea that comes across in most of the writers at the time, is that we have these separate spheres, and I've used the word separability to describe this. That is, they assume that the moral motives, what Smith called the moral sentiments, can be separated from what Smith would call the material interests. So our economic incentives can be pursued in a way which have no effect on our moral outlook. Now, that turns out to be radically false. It simply can't be done. If we live in a society which is entirely based on appealing to people's self-interest when they shop, it shouldn't be very surprising that's going to spill over into other aspects of life. We now have very good evidence that, for example, treating people as if they're selfish through the use of incentives can actually make them act very selfishly when they wouldn't have in the absence of the incentives.
So you have a bunch of great examples, empirical evidence in your work that actually shows that. And I actually found those very instrumental and quite convincing and very interesting, actually. Could you go through some of those? For example, the firefighters in Boston, I particularly like that. I like the one about the Irish and the plastic bags, as well as the Haifa case with the school children. Could you give us some of the sort of empirical foundation for this proposition?
Well, when I was just starting working on this book, I have to tell you a story about myself. My kids were getting a little older and they wanted to have a little more money for buying clothes, and they had an allowance. But I had this great idea that they could top up their allowance by doing household chores. Now, I have to say, my kids were great. They did household chores very willingly, and I never had a problem with them about that. So I thought this was a really great idea. So,
what possessed you to come up with this idea when everything was going so well?
I think I have to admit that I'm an economist, and only an economist would think of this. In any case, as you might suspect, it didn't turn out entirely well. We talked about the price list and, mowing the lawn and doing dishes and so on. And I thought we had a pretty good agreement. It was posted on the fridge. And after that, they didn't do a thing. They didn't do anything which they had done before.
This is the beginning of your disillusionment with economics?
No, I was not at all disillusioned with economics at the time. I was fascinated by it, as I have always been. But I think the joke was on me that I thought this was a way they could top up their allowances and avoid fights with their dad about clothing and things like that. And it turned out to be a very good lesson in the fact that if you appeal to people's self-interest, sometimes it brings out the self-interest. Now, there are many examples going beyond my particular experiment in home economics. The one you mentioned, the Boston fireman, is very instructive. The fire commissioner, just before Christmas a few years ago, he noticed that there were a lot of sick call-ins. It happened to be occurring more on Mondays and Fridays than during the rest of the week. Of course, thinking that was a little odd, he said that he was going to revoke the fire department's policy of unlimited sick days. And he put a limit on the sick days, and anybody claiming more days than that would have their pay docked. The firemen were not impressed. On Christmas and New Year's, the number of people calling in sick doubled. They were furious. And in the next year, the amount of people calling in sick increased tremendously. Eventually, the fire commissioner had to give it up. What was the problem here? Well, it turns out that the firemen typically went to work even if they were injured, even if they weren't feeling well. They felt obligated as professionals to defend the city and the citizens. Of course, there were some who were abusing the practice. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been all the call-ins on the Mondays and the Fridays. But what the commissioner did is he said, I don't trust you. I don't trust your professionalism as a public servant, as a firefighter. And basically what they said to him was, I won't repeat it on the air. I mean, they said, you're not trusting us.
It's okay. This isn't public radio. This is a podcast. You're allowed to curse.
I don't want to quote it because I'm not sure the firemen would like everybody to hear what they actually said. But they were furious, and they were understandably so, because they were proud men and women, and they had been diminished by this. But here's another case, maybe not as exciting, but also very meaningful. In the city of Haifa in Israel, there was a group of daycare centers, a large number of them actually, 16 of them, all under the same management. And as is often the case at daycare centers, the parents were coming late to pick up the kids. So they decided they would put a fine on lateness. And just as they're about ready to do this, a couple of economists who were aware of this came along and said, no, wait a second, let's turn this thing into an experiment. So what they did was they took half the daycare centers and they imposed the fine there. And the other half of the centers, they didn't do anything. So for a couple of weeks, they recorded exactly how many people were coming late at the control centers and at the treatment centers being where the fine would be imposed. And then in the treatment centers, they put on the door, as of next week, anybody coming more than 10 minutes late to pick up their kids at the end of the day will be fined 10 Israeli shekels. There was no explanation about why this was being done because the economists, who are very good experimental economists, they said, we don't want to frame this as anything, just say there's a fine. So let's see what the fine does. Okay, they waited and they counted and saw who's coming late and so on at both the control schools and the treatment schools. Now, I'll bet you can guess what happened. What happened is that at the places where the fine was imposed, the number of parents coming late doubled. It doubled. The fined parents came later. Nothing happened in the control schools. Obviously, after 17 weeks, they decided to can the experiment because it wasn't working very well. But they were distressed to find out that, well, now the late parents kept on coming late, even though they weren't being fined anymore. Now, what's going on here? Well, one possible interpretation is that the parents thought that the fine was how expensive it was to the school for them coming late. And so they just got that information. In that case, the price would have been conveying information about how costly it was. I don't think that's a very reasonable explanation. It could be. Far more likely is the explanation offered by the authors of this study, which was that prior to the fine, coming on time was an obligation. It's something you felt morally obliged to do if you could, and it was an obligation you had to the teachers or to your own kids and who might be anxious about you not showing up. You did the best you could. But sometimes you got stuck in traffic, or sometimes you got into a conversation and you forgot to pick up your kid on time. But you should have done it, and you knew you should have done it. Once they put a price on it, it became a commodity. Like a shirt. You want the shirt? Step right up. You just have to pay for it. Lateness became a commodity which you could buy, and they were happy to buy lateness for 10 Israeli shekels. So what that says is incentives can sometimes backfire.
What I think is also really interesting there with what you're saying is implied in that is that the mothers, the parents were motivated to act in a particular way that could not be, or perhaps could be compensated financially, but at a much higher price. And so perhaps if you put the fine at 10 million shekels, then no one would have been late. But what that also speaks to is the challenge of pricing. And also, of course, what pricing does in terms of conveyance of information and what it says, which I think is really interesting. That gets into some other things of your work. But go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just wanted to throw that in there.
This is exactly, the price is a piece of information, and here it was the information about the situation that we're in. Economists don't think very much about situations, about the situation a person is in. We think about people having some tastes or preferences, and we act according to those. Psychologists say how we act depends a lot on the situation. For example, it's much easier for us to be selfish when we're shopping than it is for us to be selfish when we're dealing with family members. Well, this was a case in which the presence of the incentive, the price, said, oh, this is like shopping. This isn't like dealing with a family member. So that essentially turned the switch, shopping, and when it used to be something like, oh, family or friends. But let's not be down on incentives. Incentives absolutely are essential to how the economy works, and they don't always backfire at all. There are lots and lots of examples in which incentives are absolutely necessary. Huge number of jobs in a modern economy are jobs that nobody would do unless they were well paid to do them. So we can't forget that. But here's an example in which incentives, just like at the Haifa daycare centers, were imposed with a surprising result. Ireland passed a law imposing a small price or tax on the use of plastic bags. The consumer had to pay. And within 2 weeks, plastic bags disappeared from use in Ireland, virtually. They fell 92%. I mean, you couldn't find people carrying a plastic bag. Having a plastic bag was like having a fur coat in the closet, the closet of bad social practices. Well, now, what's the difference? There was a fine, and people responded to the fine avidly. Now, what's the difference? Well, I think we should look at the details. The difference was that in Ireland, as a part of the legislative deal which would have been possible to get this thing through, it was agreed upon that there should be a long public information campaign prior to the imposition of the tax. And this included some very clever advertising about what a beautiful place Ireland was, and plastic bags are ugly, and don't trash the Emerald Isle, and so on. So there was an idea of the moral purpose of this fine. And remember, in Haifa, there was just a little sign on the door saying, you come late, you get fined, because they wanted this to be an experiment without any framing. Well, the moral framing in Ireland apparently did the trick. So let's go back to the day of Aristotle. Okay, we're going to be in Athens, and we're 23 or something BC, and they're mounting a big naval expedition in the Adriatic. It's huge, hundreds of ships, and the ships are going to be carrying cavalry, and so there's horses and soldiers and so on, and they have to mobilize the ships. At the time, they didn't have a substantial navy, so they had to recruit a very large number of ships from private practice. So they decided they would do this, the council decided they would do it essentially by requiring rich people to produce these ships, that is presumably their own ships or rent them, fully equipped and brought to the port at Piraeus near Athens. Now, what was interesting about this is that this was all managed by a system of prizes. People who got there first got a huge prize, and the prize would be announced at some ceremony, and many prizes on down the line. So the incentives were framed as prizes, not as compensation. And moreover, there was very severe costs to not doing it on time. Now, a further aspect of this was that essentially the council appointed a rich person to get a ship. So it was called his liturgy. If he had a liturgy and there was some other rich guy who he thought should have got it instead of him, the obligation to bring the ship, he could just go to the other rich man and say, you take my obligation. And if the other guy refused, then the second person had to exchange his property with the person who had the liturgy. In other words, I have the obligation to bring the ship. I think you're richer than me. So I go to you and say, hey, it's yours. And if you say no, I get your property. Now, if I was wrong and actually you were poor, then I just made a bad mistake, right? So in other words, it's a marvelous example of what in economics is called mechanism design. It uses the information that I have about you, and you have, that the government doesn't have at all. And they actually implemented that. So they actually allowed people to impose this obligation on somebody else at the risk of actually having to exchange property. Now, what did that accomplish? Altogether, it made extraordinarily clear why this was important. They explained over and over again that there were pirates and they had to set up a naval base and all kinds of other stuff. So the purpose was well explained. Things were presented in a way which enhanced the social and civic standing of the individual. And if you didn't do it, you got penalized. And it was fair. Okay, now let's imagine this. Let's go back to Haifa. And suppose that the Haifa daycare centers are getting worried about parents coming late. And instead of two economists showing up to advise them about how to do it, some Athenians in a time machine show up. So they show up from the 3rd century BC or 4th century BC, and they're going to advise this daycare center. And let's think what would have been on the door of the Haifa daycare center. What it said was this very bland thing under the authority of blah, 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 you're going to get fined. Instead, the Athenian side would say, the Council of Parents and Teachers would like to thank all parents who come on time, which virtually all of you do. And those with a perfect record of on time picking up your kids will be awarded with a prize at the next celebration of teachers and parents. There are a few of you who occasionally have not come on time, and we understand that sometimes this is because of circumstances beyond your control. If this should occur, you'll meet with a group of teachers and other parents to determine whether the cause of lateness was permitted or not. If it was not permitted or not excusable, you'll pay a fine, and that wouldn't be 10 shekels, it would be 1,000 shekels or some other amount. And this fine will be announced also at the celebration of the teachers and parents next year. Now, suppose that had been the sign on the door or something like it. What do you think would have happened? I think it would have been like the plastic bag situation in Ireland. I don't think any parents would have come late. And I think there's a way of formulating incentives so that they work. But notice what's crucial. The incentives have to be fair, they have to be in the public interest, and that they cannot be serving the greed of the person who is designing the incentive. That's the problem. When you see a person who's self-interested designing incentives so as to manipulate somebody else to capture a lot of profits for the first person, those are the examples which we see in experiments in which the subjects who are subject to these fines or subsidies or whatever they are, they just basically say, go to hell. And they do the opposite thing. They do it again and again.
In that case, it's like an incentive vice. You've got the prize on the one hand, which is the reframing of the penalty, and on the other hand, you have the shaming component, which is very powerful. And in fact, much of what you're describing is stuff that we have seen organically grow up in online communities. And in fact, when you were talking as well, one of the other things that sort of came to my mind was how poorly mercenary armies perform to democratically sort of community organized armies. In fact, the Athenians, who you mentioned, were a very effective fighting force. In particular, what some could say specifically because, in large part because they were a democratic society fighting against other sort of authoritarian regimes like the Persian Empire. But I was also thinking the counter to that, which is that, in fact, crowdfunding very much works in the way that you're describing. It's a reframing of price and value so that you're able to actually raise a tremendous amount of money by not providing where near a fraction of what you would otherwise if you were to frame it in traditional economic terms. The one thing that I had thought about before our interview, all these sort of experiments and also anecdotes of the Athenians and other sort of cases are smaller societies. Is there something to be said about the fact that we have scaled a much larger society, and so it's much more difficult to implement these types of rules and these types of incentive structures? Is that part of the challenge that we face?
Well, there is, of course, a face-to-face element in some of the small-scale societies that work in a cooperative way. We see that among hunters and gatherers with whom we've done lots of experiments about cooperation, and they indeed are very cooperative people on the whole. Although not uniformly, there are some quite selfish hunter-gatherer people too. But we have a capacity now to communicate over a very large scale through, obviously, communications that are now available by digital and other means. And so we can have the equivalent of face-to-face in a lot of respects. Now, if you're doing things in a local community, in a village, and you cross somebody, you're likely to be in trouble with them, maybe even physically. They'll be around. And it isn't the same online. But we do have lots of examples of people devoting a huge amount of time to help a common project and to make it succeed. These go from non-commercial things or largely non-commercial things like Wikipedia, to which people devote a huge number of hours, and it's a very, very good piece of work, to more quasi-private or more public things like open source software, which is produced in cooperative teams, obviously people competing for reputation, but often hardly ever for ownership. And so you think of an open source software group of engineers working. They're a lot like hunter-gatherers. There's some people who are good knowledge hunters and some people who aren't very good at it. And you get a big kick out of solving problems, and you get a lot of admiration for it. And you probably get some, side benefits, but you're doing it because you love being good at stuff. It's not entirely generous, because part of this is just, wanting to be the best hunter. I think we would help understand ourselves a lot better if we looked in the research areas of our societies now and we called ourselves knowledge hunters and then thought back about why hunter-gatherers hunt, the males. Now think about it. In many societies, if you capture a large animal, if you kill a large animal, you bring it back and then it'll be divided up equally and distributed to everyone. And I mean equally, because we've actually measured, who killed it and who ate it, and we know who ate it, and it gets distributed. Now, that's one thing that people do. I've actually hunted with people who divide things up in this way. And for example, one day we discovered a huge amount of honey. This is in Tanzania with the Hadza people, a huge amount of honey. We brought the thing back. There were only there were 3 of them, and I was tagging along. Happy, by the way, that we didn't get to kill any animals, which would have upset me considerably. But we got the honey. That was good. We brought the honey back, and the first thing that happened, and by the way, honey, they could have just conserved it, and they could have eaten it over some period of time. But no, a bunch of teenagers went running and found other groups of a similar tribe, a similar language group. And by the end of the day, there must have been 60 or 70 people having a big honey party. So that's a kind of process which we are capable of doing, and we also do in the modern world a lot. Now, I think economics doesn't understand these processes very well. And one of the reasons why we don't is that as economists, we think about, we do this in order to get stuff or to have it. We save, invest, work, shop, and so on. It's all about getting stuff. A lot of what we do is not only about getting stuff, it's getting to be someone. It's affirming our identity, affirming who we are, or actually constructing who we are. So, if you ask me, why am I honest? You could say, I'm honest because every time I do something honest where I might have been tempted not to be, I'm affirming myself as an honest person. And there are many things that we do that have more to do with producing ourselves, if you can just see what I mean, producing ourselves as a human being and not getting stuff. What you wear and how you talk and the kind of job you do, of course it's part of keeping warm and getting income and so on, but it's also part of being who you are. Now, leaving out that part of humanity, something very well understood, obviously, in the other social sciences, not to mention other human beings understand this very well, it has a problem because the incentives that sometimes backfire, they should work economically if all we care is about getting stuff. But sometimes to respond to an incentive would make me feel undignified. It would make me feel like I'm selfish. It would deprive me of the pride that I would have that I'm doing something public-spirited just because it's public-spirited. So it's ignoring the side of humanity which would like to be a good person, ignoring that aspect. Now, that's not always operative, and there's no reason why it should be. As I say, shopping is mostly a place where being pretty selfish is all right, although you'd certainly want to expect that people might have some misgivings about buying goods that were cheap because they were produced by child labor, or produced in countries where labor unions don't have rights, or produced in countries which are trashing the environment. But by and large, when you're choosing between a couple of different bottles of milk, why not go for the lowest price?
So a few things, there are actually three things that you're saying I want to follow separate threads on. One is, in fact, I don't know anyone that consumes sort of like a robot. The ones that do are actually doing it for reasons that have nothing to do with consumption. It's filling some emotional gap. So in fact, I find that anecdotally speaking, it's the most common sense assertion what you're making. The other thing that you're sort of touching on there is the crowding out effect, which is that by framing something in a particular way, you're crowding out a huge section of the people who would engage in a positive, socially positive behavior if it were not sort of incentivized in a particularly perverse manner. Can you talk a little bit about the crowding out effect, and then also the opposite of that, which is crowding in? And how would you go about, and then this would be a kind of a good segue to talk about how these sort of ideas and outcomes and research and conclusions you have here could go into formulating better regulatory structures, laws, incentive structures for society, et cetera. And I should say also, the really bringing it back to something I mentioned at the beginning, which is Hayek and the problem of information and creating distributed systems that aren't centrally organized, which I would think are more complementary for the type of society we live in today. Thinking about how to combine all of these into that type of a system so that people can act more sort of in a more free society that is more compatible with where we are today.
Well, the basic idea that a price is a piece of information, which is, of course, a basic economics from Hayek, is part of the way I look at the problem of experiments and what we can learn from just observing economic activity in experiments. Let me tell you one experiment which I think is very indicative of how people act. There is a game which is called the trust game. It's very simple. There are two parties. The first party, sometimes called the investor, is given by the experimentalist a sum of money. And the investor can invest in the second person, sometimes called the trustee. That means transfer, say, $50 or some amount of money from the amount which the investor has received. Then the trustee gets the money, but the amount transferred, if the investor has transferred $100, the amount that shows up there in the trustee's kitty is $300, so it's tripled. So this investment pays off. And then the trustee has the option of giving some back to the investor. And of course, they could give back half, let's say. They could give back nothing. And both parties know the rules. Both parties know how much the guy had to start with. So suppose the guy had 100 and he gave 100. Wow. Then the trustee would say, I guess he trusts me. And then, of course, if he's selfish, he'll say, well, that was his mistake, and it wouldn't give him back anything because he'd have 300, and then there you go. Well, that's not what people do. The investors who give generously to the trustees are very rewarded by the trustees. They give back a lot. Now, think about, first, an economist looking at this would say, well, that's crazy because obviously the game can't be the way any human being would play, because a selfish human being, which is the human beings that economists tend to think about, a selfish human being would reason the following way. Okay, I'm the investor. What should I do? The trustee, he's selfish just like me. So I give him 100, he gets 300, and he walks. That's it. And I get nothing. So what should I give him? Obviously, I should give him nothing. So I should give him nothing. I get nothing. He gets nothing. That's the solution of the game by an economist.
And you all starve.
Yes. Everybody goes home with their pockets empty, okay? That's not what happens. What happens is investors are pretty generous. The trustees are pretty generous, and because they're reciprocating. And the key result here is that the more the investor gives, the more the second party gives back. It's just reciprocity.
And it's also interesting because I've seen this game, and it has some sort of superficial qualities in a way to the prisoner's dilemma. And in fact, what's really interesting about it when I think about it in relation to the prisoner's dilemma is that in this case, the big differentiator is the access to information and communication, that you are able to communicate actively, dynamically with the other party as opposed to being siloed, which is a much more natural way that human beings interact.
That's right. This is a game that's played sequentially. The investor moves first, and then the trustee moves. In the prisoner's dilemma game, we ask people to make the choices separately. The two prisoners are separate, and they make a separate choice, not knowing what the other one did. By the way, this is a small digression, but in a prisoner's dilemma game, if you play it sequentially, so that the first person to chooses, I'm not going to confess, a very large number of the second movers will then say, I'm not going to confess either.
If they knew. If they knew
the first person had done that, because people essentially just don't want to be exploited by the other person. So that's the way the trust game works, and it works that way wherever you do it in the world, basically. It's been done lots and lots of times. But here's an ingenious experiment. Suppose that I'm the trustee, and I'm going to offer you 100. So I offer you 100, but I also send you a message that if you give me back less than, say, $250, I'm going to punish you, and I have a fine I can impose on you. So notice, if I require you to give me back $250, I'm going to end up with $250, and you're going to end up with $50, because the total that you got when my 100 was tripled is $300. So you're going to look at that, and you're going to say, wow, I just got heavily incentivized to give back at least $250, otherwise I'm going to get fined. What do people do then? They reciprocate less. They reciprocate less when they're going to get fined if they don't reciprocate. Well, I mean, if you're an economist, this is, wow, how could that happen? If you're a psychologist, it's pretty natural because you've just been insulted. You've been insulted by the guy who says, I don't trust you to reciprocate, so I'm going to fine you if you don't. But now here's the ingenious in this experiment. In the third treatment, they gave the investor the opportunity to fine the other guy, but they also gave the investor the opportunity to not make use of the fine. So in other words, I could say to you, I'm giving you $100. I have the right to fine you if I would like, but I'm not going to use it. Well, what happens then? Then they really reciprocate much more than at first. And why is that? They reciprocate because now they have two pieces of information about the investor. The first one is he's generous and trusting because he gave me 100. But then he actually had the opportunity to safeguard himself, and he didn't do it. So he was really generous and trusted me. And so the fact that conveying that I could have fined you, but I don't do it, is much more powerful than just not fining you at all.
Well, look, another great contemporary example of this at work is in the ongoing sort of crisis, or however you want to call it, with North Korea, the North Koreans and the Americans. If this were a prisoner's dilemma paradigm, it's very simple. The United States would simply bomb North Korea. But that's not the case. We care about who is going to die. We care about the South Koreans. We care about a huge number of things. It's not simply a matter of clear-cut, brutal self-interest. And in fact, before the mutually assured destruction policy, MAD, in the 1970s or late 60s, we went through a whole period of building up our arms here in the U.S. and in the Soviet Union without having a nuclear war. So, in fact, reality bears out what you're describing. I mean, I don't think it's a controversial view at all. I think what's really interesting, and I want to say this to our audience because we've talked about this quite a bit now in a number of episodes where we've described these neoclassical models that model reality in a way that is convenient for the mathematics, but in fact loses sight of so much of the reality. And it's sort of a lazy process. And I think that is the best explanation for why such a common sense idea, which is to take human beings as they are, is beneficial. I think also I should mention something else. We didn't talk about Hume in our earlier discussion, but Hume makes a sort of similar point when he says something along the lines of I think it's Hume that says this, but you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that it's interesting that these particular set of ideas operate so well in politics when in fact they do not exist in fact in the real world.
It's good you brought up Hume because what he wrote in 1742 was, political writers have established it as a maxim that in contriving any system of government, every man ought to be supposed to be a knave and to have no other end in his actions than his private interest. By this interest we must govern him, and by means of it make him, notwithstanding his insatiable avarice and ambition, cooperate to the public good. Now, that's a statement just like Machiavelli. He said, we should act like everybody is as selfish as a knave in designing a constitution. But immediately after this, he says, but it's not true. That's not what people are like. Hume was a great moral philosopher who understood that humans were often given to moral behavior, as was Machiavelli. So why are these guys saying that we should design a constitution for knaves when there's only a minority of people who are knaves? It's only because they think that you can separate the self-interest of the knave, you can manipulate the knave's self-interest and get him to act less knavishly without undermining the moral behavior of the rest of the society. And that's, I think, where Hume got it wrong and where Smith got it wrong and where Machiavelli got it wrong. Not understanding that if you organize society based entirely on incentives, you're going to run the risk of diminishing people's moral commitments. And then you're really in a mess, because then you have a society which is less morally committed. And then what's your choice? You have to use more and more material incentives. But the material incentives can then corrode even further the moral fabric of the society. It's a slippery slope. Unfortunately, I don't think we're on it, but we have to be aware of it.
So that's really cool that you brought up that quote, and you did it justice. Obviously, I was mangling it. But, in the road from Aristotle, what I see, and especially sort of clarified through that quotation and through this conversation, is that we begin in this place where philosophers are attempting to create a system of laws that takes into account human beings as they are, or closer to what they are. And then we move more towards this model. But of course, people like Hume and Machiavelli are saying, okay, it is a model. It is a model. It is not reality. And so eventually we've come to a place where it's become more of reality. In other words, the map has become the territory the map. And I think that's something that we see across society. And of course, culturally we see that aspect of selfishness and that embrace of selfishness today in a way that we would not have. I also think, and I wonder about this because some other people have done really great work. I had read this other book by Jonathan Haidt about behavioral psychology and moral psychology, about what makes, good people act badly. I don't remember what it was exactly, but we see the consumerism today where people embrace selfish motives and self-interest. So I guess just to kind of close it off, I would like to ask you, how would you implement these insights today in the economy that we have and that we're going into, which is a much more knowledge-based technological society? And to that point, do you think at all, or have you considered at all, the technology of blockchain in this context because of its decentralized nature?
I think there are a bunch of lessons that come across from the experimental literature and also the economic theory. Perhaps the first one is that incentives work perfectly well in many settings, and this is not an argument against incentives. This is an argument against the use of incentives to aggrandize or to enhance the wealth and status of a person already well endowed against a weaker person. That's what always can be counted on to get a reaction. Or if it's used to control another person. We know that from experiments going back to the 70s, that paying people to do things that they might have liked to do leads them to drop off doing those things because they don't want to be controlled. It's called overdetermination. That is, I like painting this picture, but if this is with kids, if you pay kids for painting pictures, when they come into the playroom the next day, they don't pick up the paints because they really liked the idea that they were doing what they wanted to do. And now they suspect that somehow they may have been responding to the money. So I think that the problem with incentives is not intrinsic to incentives. It's intrinsic to greed and control as aspects of social relations between principals and agents in relationships like employment, in banking, and in other aspects of society. But we've learned a lot also that, for example, making clear what the social or moral or collective objective of incentives is, for example, about environmental protection and so on, appealing to rather than ignoring people's better selves should be part of the incentive structure. It's also important in designing constitutions and legal frameworks. We have to find ways of protecting the civic-minded and the generous from the selfish, because the quickest way to unravel a kind of cooperative situation is if there are a few jerks involved who are essentially exploiting that situation. And that's why essentially some kind of enforcement against rank self-interest is absolutely necessary. You can't trust people to be good. Let me give you an example. In Bogota, Colombia, a decade ago, there was a terrible problem of traffic fatalities. And the fatalities had tended to take place at the crosswalks, the white and black crosswalks, called locally zebras because of their striping. And among the worst offenders were the taxi drivers. And this had been a problem for a long time. The then mayor of the city of Bogota, Colombia, what did he do? He hired 140 clowns. That's right, clowns. And the clowns went out to the major crosswalks in town, dressed up, like clowns, and they just ridiculed the violations. And they were hugely, they were cheered on by the pedestrians, and the taxi drivers were humiliated and shamed. And the mayor was great. He asked the pedestrians, would they please nominate very polite and pedestrian-friendly taxi drivers, which they did. And the first 140 who were nominated formed what was then called the Knights of the Zebra, named after the crosswalks, and they had little plastic zebras which they could have in their cars. And there was also one lady of the zebra, one lady taxi driver.
Were they bobblehead zebras?
I don't know what kind of zebras they were. But in any case, traffic fatalities fell off dramatically. I actually studied this. I didn't believe the statistics at first. And it fell off dramatically, and it didn't happen in other parts of the country. But an important part of this was the ones who continued to violate the crosswalks were really hammered by the cops. So it was a combination of mobilizing public sentiment for good behavior, to which almost all the taxi drivers responded, and then also combining that with some tough penalties for those who didn't. So I think that's another thing we can take on board. I think there's some other things that we might want to think about. I mean, for example, the simple example you gave about if you play games sequentially, sometimes you can signal your intention of being generous, and people can respond to that. There are a bunch of other fancier things we could think of, but I think there's no shortage of policy measures that could be undertaken. But, the main thing is that when we see incentives being advocated for things like losing weight or reading books or voting, monetary incentives, we have to think carefully about this, because these are things that people want to do anyway. They want to lose weight. They want to read the book. They want to be a good citizen. Offering money for things like that can be a double-edged sword. And maybe this is one of the reasons why in many areas of education, for example, incentivizing things like grades and so on hasn't worked very well, because people, just like the Haifa daycare center, you can substitute your economic interest for your moral interest, and maybe the second one isn't strong enough to get you to go and read the book after you figured out that, I'd feel pretty good if I read a book.
Okay, so in fact, before we go, there is one more thing that I did forget that I did want to ask you about, because I came across something that you're involved in. I don't know exactly how you're involved. I want to ask you about it, but it's this thing called Core Initiative, and I think it's interesting because it's very similar to some of the stuff that I've been working on with Hidden Forces, which is really, from my perspective, I don't know exactly, this seems more like a straight-up educational initiative, but in any case, it looks like you're dealing in the area of helping to scale educational material for people, specifically in economics. But why don't you tell me a little bit about Core Initiative? Because I find that sort of stuff fascinating, and I think it's the future of so much learning, and also the future of news is really that synergy of unscripted content and ed tech.
CORE, that's C-O-R-E, is a project which I helped to found. It's a global collaboration of economists, researchers primarily, and we've contributed, volunteered our time and hard work to produce an e-text. It's online, it's free, and just in case you hadn't noticed, free compares to maybe $300 for an intro textbook in economics today. So this thing is online. It's a new course. It's not a MOOC. It's a very good book. It's interactive. The graphs all move. You can manipulate things with lots of data exercises and activities. Remarkably, this has been already adopted as the standard economics course, replacing the traditional course at some of the top universities in Europe. So it's been very well received. And the reason why it's been well received is something about which I think we should be optimistic. And that's because economics has changed tremendously in the last 30 years. We used to go with the byline, economics as if the last 30 years had happened. And we wanted what the undergraduates were getting to catch up with what we do as economists. Now, think about it. In the last 30 years, a lot of big changes have taken place. And I think, putting it very roughly, Homo economicus is now a little bit in disrepute, and so is laissez-faire after the financial crisis. So these basic elements of the introductory textbook, they look a little odd, not to the students perhaps don't know, but to the professors, because we know that behavioral economics has changed the face of economics, about what we think about economic psychology and human beings. We know that the financial crisis and many other things, including climate change, have let economists, even quite conservative ones, worry a lot about unregulated markets. So a lot's been going on. And moreover, today, the people who come to study economics, what do they want to know about? They want to know about inequality. They want to know about climate change. You may say, how do I know that? I know that because around the world, the first day of class, before one word has been uttered about what this class is going to be about, we ask a question. Write down on a piece of paper, please, what are the main issues that economics should be addressing today? We've done this all over the world. We've done it with central bankers. We've done it with treasury officials. We've done it with students. And then we make a word cloud. In a word cloud, the size of the word is how many times that word or that phrase is mentioned. So we have these word clouds, a very large number of them. And what's the dominant theme? What's the thing in the largest font? Almost always, inequality. And what's second? Climate change. Prominently displayed is things like robots or job displacement or instability. Now ask yourself, in how many introductory classes are you going to get those topics as the main topics that we have to address? In how many courses are you going to get that stuff at the front of the book, not at the end of the book where you can maybe read it or not, read it at the beach, it'll never be covered in the course, certainly won't be on the exam. So what we've done is we've taken what contemporary economics really is, what we do as economists, and we've taken what the students care about and we've put them right at the front of the book. And it really works. Students get highly motivated and they do extremely well in their second and third year courses, even if those courses are the same, overly abstract, not very real world grounded. So this is Core Economics, C-O-R-E. It stands for Curriculum Open Access Resources for Economics. You can see it online anywhere in the world. If you have a telephone, you can take this course.
Professor, it was great having you on. Thank you so much. I would have loved to get into some more of the stuff on inequality. It's something that I've been covering on Hidden Forces from a number of different perspectives, but maybe I can have you on another day and we can do that.
That would be great. I enjoyed it very much, Demetri.
Okay, thanks again. And that was my episode with Sam Bowles. I want to thank Dr. Bowles for being on my program. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforcespod.com. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforcespod.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.